I can't tell you how incredibly thrilled we are to be here at the Aspen Ideas Festival. And certainly when PBS learned that we would have the opportunity to join with Abigail Disney and this incredible film and to be able to bring it to our audiences, which we look forward to being able to do next year. So you're really getting a sneak peek of some wonderful work that really speaks to so many of the things that just as a community we're all talking about in this very moment. And so we're incredibly proud to be able to do that. I will say, just as a quick introduction of Abigail, that I have been an admirer of her work for quite some time. I am Liberian American and actually grew up in the United States only after the military coup that happened in Liberia. And if you haven't seen Abigail's amazing film, Pray the Devil Back to Hell, it's a film that you should all see. It's extraordinary. Obviously, these two wonderful people in the center need no introduction because you've just spent quite a bit of time with them, but we're incredibly grateful to both Lucia and to Rob Schenck for joining us here today. And I must say that it struck me today that, that as we gather here, obviously in Charleston, the rest of the country has been closely following what's been happening there and the homegoing service for Reverend Clementa Pinckney. And, it doesn't, it's one of those things where sometimes it really just does take your breath away. I wanted to start off with a moment of silence, but I thought that actually I'd prefer to do something else, which is to uplift this sanctuary of ours, our own sanctuary of ideas where we've created some space to come and talk and engage with each other. So I would just ask you to turn to someone next to you and just say welcome.
Welcome.
Welcome. Welcome. Today in Charleston, President Obama, when he gave the eulogy at the service, he quoted the song that you used to close this film, Amazing Grace. And he talked a lot about grace. At one point he said, that the person responsible for these killings and for this atrocity was so blinded by hatred that he failed to see the power of God's grace. And I have to confess to having seen an earlier cut of this film where you started the film, Abigail, with a quote about costly grace. Mm-hmm. And so I was hoping you would tell us more about why this was such a through line for you.
Yeah. Well, I think that grace may be the precious resource we've been not paying attention to in the public square, in the public discourse, in our political lives. And I talked about, partly the quote at the front of the film is partly a gift to Rob, who has studied and loves Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who I'd never heard of before I met Rob. And then I started reading around and paying attention to who he was. And he's an astonishing figure from Germany in the run-up to World War II, who really displayed an astonishing amount of costly grace in opposing the rise of the Nazi regime and the many things that happened in that time. I put it there because I knew Rob would need a lot of courage, and that there would be many times he'd be sitting here watching this film and contemplating the change in his life as a result of it. And so I wanted him to have a little check-in with himself every so often. It never hurts, to sit and have a moment with your values. That quote was too long and too complicated for people, and so we shortened it up with this other quote. But I grew up as in a very conservative Catholic household, and I've left my faith practice, but I never stopped being attentive to my spiritual life and never stopped paying attention to what I was taught, and I've always tried to bring my values into my life. And so even though I live a pretty secular life, it struck me that the gun issue was an issue of spirit, and we were talking about life and death and afterlife and people taking the power, the ultimate power of life into their own hands and deciding when to use it. And a really large lobbying organization that was going about the business of essentially, if you boil it down to its bottom line, making guns easier to get, easier to carry, and easier to deploy in the public square. And that struck me as an astoundingly anti-life agenda. So it was with that I wanted to go out and find people in the pro-life world who might talk to me about that, because I just didn't understand why the overlap between the NRA's constituency was so almost absolute with the conservative pro-life evangelicals. And I talked to a few people before I got to Rob, but luckily, or maybe more than luck, brought Rob into my life right around the time that he was thinking about things differently. And so we sort of made a decision to set aside our differences and find a way to inhabit some common ground and talk about our shared values. And that was really the beginning of the film.
Well, you know, I'm looking forward to talking about so many things that I don't usually get to talk about in my daily life. You know, talking about grace, talking about the idea of having a calling, talking about transformation, talking about the ability to be converted, and using those terms in a way that in some ways is even more expansive than most people think of them. And watching the two of you come together is incredibly powerful. And before I get behind a little bit of the ideas, I would love to know the road that really led the two of you together initially.
Me.
All roads lead to Abby.
Yeah. It's sort of not supposed to happen that way, but documentary-wise, but it was just impossible not to put them together. They were speaking the same language, and they were never going to know each other. I mean, it was too much of a violation of my ability as a person who brings people together. I just couldn't possibly respect the documentary line at the cost of putting people together who really needed to know each other.
It's fascinating to me that you say that, because one of the things that is so striking to me about the film is that it gives you that intimate access to that level of intra-community conversation that you usually are never privy to unless you are a member of that community. And I kept thinking to myself throughout how much I wished that there was more of a space for that type of conversation across groups when we're not at a flashpoint. And so maybe I'll turn to you, Rob, and because in some ways it was really taking us within a community that you know well and that you hold dear. What did that feel like, being able to have that conversation, but to know that ultimately those conversations would be shared outside?
At first, it was nerve-wracking. It was disconcerting, because, as you say, a lot of religious groups are by nature insular. I mean, we speak an idiosyncratic language, and even when you just referred to Pastor Pinckney's homegoing, that's a term of art, if you will, I think in the most beautiful way, in a certain Christian community. When we talk about funerals as homegoing services, because the person is flying home to heaven with God. And so, we have a lexicon and a language, and I think that was not just Abby's brilliance in realizing the chemistry that would occur between Lucy and me, but it was also her heart, her very expansive heart, to give that as a gift, I think maybe to both of us. And, of course, it was really more, Abby was something of a facilitator, but Lucy was coming to my neighborhood, Capitol Hill, and testifying before some of my friends, the people I not only care for sometimes in a pastoral capacity as a minister to them, but also have as personal friends. So it was even more than our common Christian faith, which I was very happy to discover, and kind of puts you in a secret society. It's sort of like you have a pinky shake. You know, it's, I know you, you know me, right? and it was that, but it was also the fact that Lucy was coming into my space, literally, bringing that message. And Abby had created safe space for us to have that conversation. And that made it easier for me over time to think about going more public, even with some of those closed-door sessions. And they literally were. In fact, I don't know that in the 130-year history of the Evangelical Church Alliance there was ever an outsider invited into one of those meetings, let alone a filmmaker and her crew, which speaks to Abby's expertise, because they hardly knew there were cameras and microphones there. But having that very honest discussion, and after a short time, I became very relaxed with their presence, and so did others, but also relieved that we were coming out, to use a certain metaphor, coming out of the closet with both opinions on both sides. It was a wonderful experience, a wonderful experience.
Lucia, you are an extraordinary person, caught up in very extraordinary circumstances, and it's one of those things where I think Rob may have articulated this point in the film when he said that you took the theoretical and you made this real and personal. I remember initially when the news reports started after Jordan was lost to us, and every time I saw you, one of the things that just struck me was just a feeling like there was a light that had been extinguished inside of you. And what's been fascinating to me, just seeing the film and seeing your own process, is seeing that light return. And I think that I'm imagining that some of that is because you have found a calling and you have found a purpose to move forward. But I want to learn more about what this journey's been like for you.
Oh, as I was just, saying to Abby even earlier, and my colleague in the audience there, this is still so surreal to me. There are days that I wake up and say, wow, did this really happen? Is God really allowing me to be a voice? Is God really allowing me in this tragedy to do something that's really going to speak volumes to his people? And so that has probably been the catalyst for really giving me something to live for, something to move forward to. And so I know it sounds really silly, but for me, what God has given me to do with my life now, I count it all joy. Because my life has a sense of meaning and purpose. And I know that Jordan is just intricately involved in that purpose. And that what we do matters. It really, really matters, not at just this moment, but it will matter for moments to come and generations to come. And so that is my life and my experience now. And I'm no longer devastated. I think that I feel alive in being able to help humanity, in being able to take all of the pain and the tragedy and turn it into something that's going to be useful and good and save lives. And so yes, I finally found my purpose. And that's an amazing thing, even out of the way that I have found my purpose. It's amazing to know that I've been allowed to do this for humanity.
And it's stunning just the way in which the circles come back, and looking back on your father's life and your father's legacy and that sense of history, and now advancing that. I'm wondering what that's been like just for the rest of your family, seeing you emerge in this way as a leader in this new sense.
It's they all keep saying, "Wow, you're just like Daddy. Wow, you're just like Daddy." And when I look in the mirror now, I see my father, and now I completely understand his need. He was so driven to make sure that people, as I said in the movie, were able to live with their civil and human rights abided by. And I did not understand him being gone, and I didn't understand him basically giving up his dental practice, pretty much, for the cause of the NAACP and for the cause of others. But I can honestly say, when I look in the mirror now, I say, wow, yeah, Daddy, I really, really understand. And that now has become my life and my cause, and the passion behind it, because I feel like I can't work fast enough. I feel like I can't do enough to keep one more person from dying the way that Jordan has died, the way that all of those 9 congregants at Emmanuel AME Church just died. I feel like there's so much we have to do when we don't have a lot of time.
You were just talking about sacrifice, and I know, Rob, in the film you had said several times, you talked about your own fears about what taking this stance and taking it publicly might cost you. And so I wonder, what has it cost you?
It certainly cost the suspicion of some of my constituents, a number of them. It's created some measure of tension in my universe. I mean, we're really just kind of rolling out this message now. And we've lost some financial supporters. There have been some who have announced that, others who have quietly disappeared. My accountants for our organization have been ringing alarms and saying we're way behind where we were a year ago. And, as we look at it, there's really only one difference, and that's your involvement in this issue. So there are some who are telling me, this inevitably is going to cost our organization a great deal. And it probably will. And I thought I might lose my position with the Evangelical Church Alliance as its elected chairman. But I cleared an election very strongly, and I'm serving now in another term. But there are some things, and Abby's kind gift of the quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and maybe all of you are familiar with that name, or you may know a lot about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but for me, he is my posthumous spiritual director and has helped me through this crisis. I think he was a brilliant Christian ethicist. He was a moral philosopher, and he was a martyr. He gave his life for the cause. He was hanged at age 39 by the Nazis for his resistance to the Hitler regime. And he taught me, and I've known, and of course we need no greater model than Jesus himself to tell us that there are some things that are very costly, and there are things that are worth that cost. And I've determined this is one of those things that is worth the cost, whatever that may turn out to be.
One of the things that struck me in a lot of the group conversations that you had was that people seemed to be operating from a place of their own sense of rationality, and the arguments around, whether, the road that we're on with guns is the right course. But what seemed missing in that conversation each and every time was they didn't have a Lucy. And I struggle with that because I think to myself, do you have to have this personal experience with this type of loss in order to think differently about it? And so maybe for me, the big question at the end of the day with this film, and I'd love to have all of you have a chance to take a crack at this, because I'm sure this is all you think about, is that, if as a society we have fallen prey to the temptation and we have, in a way, become addicted to our fear, how do we put on the armor of light?
You first, Rob.
Wow. Well, first, as a person of faith and as a Christian, I encourage the people around me to put their trust in God. And it's a very easy temptation. The way Bonhoeffer expressed it was the temptation to substitute the penultimate for the ultimate. What is earthly for what is heavenly. So for me as a minister, and I'm going to sound really preachy for a minute, sorry. I realize we're in a theater and not in a sanctuary, but it's all too familiar. And just say that it's too easy to look only to ourselves and our own capacities rather than to something greater than ourselves. And however someone expresses that, there is something bigger, even if it's all of humanity, if it's the totality of humanity. But I think it's even bigger than that. I think there's something much greater. And if we can get our eyes focused there and our confidence focused there, it makes this life less distressing, less insecure, but more secure. And will leave us feeling more secure. So I've tried to guide this as a theological venture, as a spiritual journey for the people I talk to. Certainly, Lucy helped with that, because if there's anything that defines evangelicalism, you could argue that the founder of evangelicalism may have been John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement that became the Methodist Church. And he described evangelical Christianity as the religion of the heart, as a religion of the heart, not of the head. So we had to get to the heart. And Lucy brought the heart into the conversation. And for evangelicals, that works, because that's where God resides, is in the heart. So maybe we do need that person and that very personal encounter, because it helps us get to the heart. And that's where a lot of powerful decisions, if not maybe all powerful decisions, are made, is in the heart.
To pick up where Rob left off, I've always said that any time you have to create change in a culture, you have to speak to the heart of man. And I believe truly that as human beings, we are to mirror the heart of God through our interactions and through our relationship with other humankind. And so in order to be able to do that, you have to prick at the heart of man. You have to nag at the conscience of man, so that man remembers that we are a mirror, we are the image of God. I think sometimes in our daily lives we become so wrapped up in our own world and, you know, taking care of our families and all the things that we have to do, but we forget about the heart of man outside of our communities, outside of the realm in which we live. And it's important always to be looking inside yourself to say, am I thinking and caring enough about others outside of my realm of existence? Am I turning a blind eye to what I see happening in the world? Because we're all called by God, your God, to be each other's keeper. And when we get to the point that we no longer see or turn a blind eye to what's happening around us, then, you know, we're on a course for destruction in terms of being, you know, human. We're called to be human. So, as I said, as Rob has said, you know, we're called to prick the heart of man so that man is reminded why we are here, and not just be reminded, but be called and motivated to act on behalf of man.
I was raised in a very conservative and very privileged home, and the two things come together in an interesting way, because what that meant was my parents shared a lot of the kind of fear that you see the evangelicals expressing in the film, and it's just an overwhelming amount of fear, and I think that is maybe a dispositional thing, or I don't know what, among conservatives and maybe among evangelicals, I'm not sure, but privilege compounded it, because if you're privileged, you actually do legitimately have people who want to come in and take things from you. That's why there are gates and walls, and so I grew up behind electric gates and big tall walls and the rest of it. And you know, when I really made a decision in my life to kind of just go and be in the world and just be a regular person, I mean, honestly, I had to make a conscious decision to do that. And my parents were so afraid for me. I mean, they really did think that I was going out and the Huns were all out there and they were just going to kind of devour me. And my mother kept saying, no, she needs some kind of protection. No, she needs some kind of person to follow you around and make sure nobody hurts you. So when you grow up in a kind of manufactured city-state kind of thing, and you envision everybody outside as these marauding hordes coming to get you, you become kind of steeped in fear, and that becomes a kind of substitute for reason or judgment, or trying to differentiate between a good person and a bad person every time you meet someone new. And it also devours your capacity for empathy. It just disappears. So the Huns out there are just really not even people. And, you know, that's not a happy way to live. And you know, we're here at the Aspen Ideas Festival. There are a lot of people with a lot of resources here in this room who probably know a lot of desperately unhappy, wealthy people. I'd say more than 50% of wealthy people are very fucking unhappy. And I think that's not a coincidence. So when my life expanded and I made a decision to be more expansive in my relationships, the experience of just being a regular person, not automatically outranking everybody I came into relationship by virtue of my resources, my mother's fear was that would destroy me, and my experience was it was the best thing that ever happened to me. And it's interesting because when I was little, I used to go to the planetarium and I'd see those shows that would say, you know, you're just one of a star in millions of stars and there's just billions and we can't count them all. And I would get really depressed by that. That would really upset me. And in my older years, I go to the planetarium and I weep for joy because it's good news, right? That you're just one star of a billion stars because you're part of something larger than yourself. And that's what it taught me. I think as Americans, we're living in a very expanded version of the little fortress I grew up in. We are telling ourselves a whole lot of stories about others outside of us trying to come and get us, from ISIS outside of our borders to people of color inside of our borders who are trying to attack our communities. My experience of conservatives is they're very generous, loving people who would never hurt an individual of another race or hurt an individual of another set of beliefs one-to-one. But somehow as classes of people, they can't extend the same level of empathy to them. So I really believe that we have a lot of work to do as a country to find a way to overcome the empathy gap that we've generated by allowing a climate of fear to grow up in our midst, by allowing the idea to penetrate us that borders are really real things, which they're not, and that the people who live in Africa have something totally different going on that has nothing to do with us, and they're all just want to take our stuff and destroy us. I mean, if you look at the map, and you look at the brightest, biggest, fattest lines on the map, they're like the equator and the latitudes and the states and the countries. They are all the fake lines. Those are the biggest lines on any given map, just the imaginary ones. You know, if anybody's ever stood at the equator, it's such a downer because it's like I keep expecting something to bump when you go, oh, nothing happens because it's an idea, you know? So we need to see our neighborhood as really being the whole neighborhood and be just as sad for Trayvon and just as sad for Jordan as we would be for our own sons and daughters, and take in the suffering and not be paralyzed by it, but say, okay, well, that happened in my neighborhood. We need to get past the need to know somebody to feel their pain. It's the only thing that will save us, empathy.
I would love for us to be able to continue. I'm going to ask one last quick question of Lucy and Rob, because I think everybody sitting here wants to know what's happening now and what's ahead of you in this space. And you know, Lucy, now you're a big lobbyist. We'd just love to know more of what the two of you are doing these days.
Well, I think we've both evolved and are still continuing to evolve. But in light of everything that has happened in my life, I have felt very compelled to go beyond my tragedy and really live with the rest of my life trying to make sure that it doesn't happen to anyone else. I have taken a position as national spokesperson with Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America and faith and community outreach organizer with Every Town for Gun Safety. So I get to help people understand dynamically what's happening in the country and lead them to solutions and ideas how we can work together in all shared communities in creating safer environments for our families and our futures.
And what my greatest goal now is simply to get this film to pastors, other church leaders, and to congregations, so they can start looking at this as a theological, moral, and ethical crisis in the church. And the reason, you know, I say that it's both a crisis in terms of ideas and thoughts and theology, but it's also a potential crisis at any moment, because we actually have evangelical pastors who are not only arming people in their churches, and we've had a new call for that since Charleston, just in the last week, but we have pastors who are going into the pulpit armed. That, to me, is an enormous crisis. And so one of the tools we have is this film. Many thanks to Abby and her company for giving us this tool so that we can get it into churches. And that's our goal at the moment.
Well, it's an extraordinary goal.
Is it okay if I say what we're going to do with it?
I was just about to turn to you to do exactly that. You and
You had a wrap-up voice on your...
I had Tell them.
Okay, so we need your help and support. So armoroflight.com, Armor the Film, I think, on Facebook. But anyway, Google Armor of Light, you'll find it all. We're all on the social media or whatever. What we're doing in the next few months is to sort of build quiet support for it. Not loud support, and that's very deliberate, because once we're up above the foxhole, incoming fire will be our life story, and it won't go away. So I don't want to cross that Rubicon until we absolutely have to. And in the meantime, in the interim, what I want us to do is take this film to people who have influence, people who have a moral and emotional credibility in the world among people who are not already on board with this. I mean, it's so easy. Stop shooting fish in barrels, people. We need to go to people who don't already agree with us on this. So find the unlikely partners and so forth. So any influencers in the conservative world, deeply in the Christian world, particularly the Christian conservative world, progressive Christians are so easy. We need them to come to us. We need to talk to them. So we're trying to build, for instance, relationships with mega church pastors, and we have 2 now who've stepped forward and 2 more who are probably going to step forward in the next couple of weeks, so that when the fire comes, it'll get reflected back. And I believe if enough people stand with us, they will do what they always do, and it will not have the same result. So we'll be out theatrically at the end of October, and we're going to get it to as many Christian communities as we can, but we're also going to take it to New York and Chicago and all the rest of the places where the choir needs practice, after all. And then hopefully PBS next year. And that will be our plan, to hopefully get as many millions of eyeballs to come out and rethink this issue from a different point of view. Not facts, not legislation, not policy. Let's just do our moral homework first.
And as the broadcaster for the film, once it does come to television, one of the things that we committed to doing was supporting a separate production of a national town hall conversation on these issues to be paired with the film. And so we're incredibly excited to be able to do that. Yeah. I will finally say to you, Lucy, you said toward the end of the film that you don't know if you will live to see the change. I will argue that you have already lived to begin to see the change.
Hear, hear.
And so we thank you all. Thanks to the Aspen Ideas Festival, Abby, Lucy, Rob. Thank you all for coming out.